Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. Imagine a world where stone towers rise like mountain peaks from the flat green plains of Southeast Asia, where the air shimmers with heat and the scent of burning incense, where thousands gather each day to honor kings who claim to be gods made flesh. This is Cambodia before the jungle returned, before the silence fell, when the greatest temple complex ever built by human hands stood at the center of an empire that stretched across the horizon. Tonight we will walk through these sacred spaces not as ruins overtaken by roots and vines, but as they were meant to be seen, alive with ceremony, brilliant with paint and gold, echoing with prayers and music. We will stand in the shadows of towers that reached toward heaven, feel the cool stone beneath our feet worn smooth by a million footsteps, hear the splash of water in vast reservoirs that turned a tropical kingdom into the most sophisticated hydraulic civilization the world had ever known. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back across the centuries to a time when Cambodia was not a small nation recovering from tragedy, but the beating heart of Southeast Asia, a place where stone and spirit merged into something that has never been equaled before or since. We will move slowly through this vanished world, pausing to observe the details that made it real, listening to voices that fell silent centuries ago, watching the play of light on stone that has witnessed the passage of 1,000 years. This is not a story of ruins, but of a living civilization at the height of its power and confidence, a culture that believed it would endure forever and built accordingly. Let your breathing slow, let your mind quiet. Let us step together into the past, into the heat and light of a tropical morning in the 12th century, when Angkor was young and the world had never seen anything like it. The land that would become the Khmer Empire begins with water. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of the great Tonle Sap lake in the 9th century, watching the seasonal miracle that defines this entire civilization. During the dry months, the lake is a modest body of water, perhaps 30 miles across, its shores lined with fishing villages built on stilts. But when the monsoon rains arrive, something extraordinary happens. The Mekong River, swollen with water from the distant Himalayas, rises so high that it reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River. The water pushes backward, flooding into the lake, which swells to more than 4 times its dry season size, spreading across the floodplain like an inland sea. This annual transformation brings with it an explosion of fish, millions upon millions, making this one of the most productive freshwater fisheries on Earth. The people who lived here learned to read these rhythms the way sailors read the stars. They built their homes to rise with the water, their entire lives oriented around this divine pulse of flood and retreat, abundance and scarcity, death and renewal. The geography of this region is deceptively simple. To the north and east, mountains mark the frontier, their peaks often hidden in clouds, their slopes covered in dense forest that no axe has touched. To the south, the Mekong Delta spreads into countless channels before emptying into the South China Sea, a maze of waterways where river and ocean merge in a landscape that changes with every tide. But here in the heart of what is now Cambodia, the land is remarkably flat, an enormous alluvial plain formed over millennia by the depositing of sediment from those annual floods. It is hot here, oppressively so. The air during the dry season feels thick enough to touch, heavy with moisture even when no rain has fallen for months, and the sun beats down with an intensity that makes the very horizon shimmer and dance. Even in the shade, the temperature hovers around 35 degrees, and to move through the midday heat is to feel your strength drain away with every step, your clothes soaked with sweat within minutes, your mouth dry no matter how much water you drink. Then the rains come. Not gentle showers but torrential downpours that transform the world into a place of steam and mud, where the distinction between earth and sky begins to blur. You can feel the rain approaching hours before it arrives. A change in the air pressure, a shift in the wind, a darkening of the sky to the southwest where the monsoon originates. The first drops are large and warm, hitting the parched earth with soft thuds that raise puffs of dust. Within moments, the drops become a deluge. A solid wall of water falling from the sky, drumming on roofs and leaves with such force that conversation becomes impossible, that visibility shrinks to a few meters, that the world narrows to the small circle of dry ground beneath whatever shelter you have found. The rain is warm, almost body temperature, and if you stand in it, you feel not cold but cleansed. the water running in streams down your face and arms, soaking your clothes until they cling to your skin, filling your ears with its roar. When the rain finally stops, as suddenly as it began, the world steams. Water evaporates from every surface, rising in visible wisps and sheets, turning the air into a sauna. The sun emerges, and everything glistens, every leaf and stone shining with moisture, every depression filled with water that reflects the sky. The temperature does not drop. If anything, it rises, the humidity making the heat more oppressive than before, making every breath feel like drinking from a cup. This is a landscape that demands adaptation, that shapes the people who live within it, that teaches them to think in terms of water and stone, of temporary shelters for the living and permanent monuments for the gods. It is a land where wood rots within years, where fabric mildews, where iron rusts, where only stone can last, and even stone is slowly eaten away by the patient work of moss and roots and the chemical action of water itself. Long before the great temples rose, this land was inhabited by communities who left traces of their presence in pottery shards and burial goods, in the foundations of wooden structures that have long since rotted away. They were rice farmers primarily, understanding that the flooded plains, once the waters receded, became the most fertile farmland imaginable, thick with nutrients washed down from distant mountains. The cultivation of rice in this environment was not simple. It required careful observation, an intimate knowledge of the timing of floods, the ability to read the sky and predict when the rains would come, too early, and the seeds would drown, too late, and they would wither in the dry earth. The farmers developed varieties of rice suited to different conditions: deep water rice that could grow fast enough to keep its head above the rising flood, shallow water rice for areas where the inundation was brief, upland rice for the slightly elevated areas that never flooded at all. They were also fishermen, masters of techniques passed down through generations, knowing where the fish gathered at different times of year, which species responded to which baits and lures, how to construct traps from bamboo that would funnel fish into enclosures from which they could not escape. During the peak of the flood season, when the Tonle Sap was at its greatest extent, fishing became the primary occupation of nearly everyone, men and women, children and elders, all working together to harvest the bounty that the water provided. They would preserve the surplus by drying fish in the sun, by fermenting them into a pungent paste called prahok that could last for months and provided essential protein during the lean seasons, by smoking them over slow fires that kept away flies and slowed decay. The smell of drying fish and fermenting paste was everywhere, a scent so pervasive that visitors from other lands found it overwhelming, but to those who grew up with it, it was simply the smell of home, of security, of survival. The people were traders too, part of a network of exchange that stretched along river routes connecting them to the coast and beyond. They traded their surplus rice and fish for salt from the sea, for iron tools forged in distant workshops, for the brilliant cloth dyed with indigo and other plant-based colors, for pottery made by specialists who had perfected the art of creating vessels that were both functional and beautiful. These trade networks were ancient, older than any kingdom or city, following routes that had been established when this region was still a patchwork of small communities, each controlling a stretch of river or a portion of lake shore, each producing certain goods and relying on others for what they could not make themselves. The rivers were the highways of this world, and those who controlled river junctions, who could tax or facilitate trade, who could provide safe harbors and markets, accumulated wealth and power that over time would be transformed into political authority. By the first centuries of the Common Era, Indian merchants and Hindu priests had begun arriving on these shores, not as conquerors but as visitors, bearing with them concepts that would take root in this new soil and grow into something uniquely Cambodian. They came seeking trade goods, the aromatic woods and resins of the forest, the precious metals that could be found in the upland regions, the exotic animals and animal products that commanded high prices in Indian markets, but they brought more than trade. They brought Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hindu scripture, a language that had never been heard in these lands, but that would become the language of royal inscriptions, of religious texts of high culture. They brought the idea of divine kingship, the notion that a ruler could embody the power of the gods themselves, could serve as a bridge between the human and divine worlds, a concept that resonated with local beliefs about the special status of chiefs and leaders, but that provided a much more elaborate theological framework for understanding royal authority. They brought Vishnu and Shiva, Brahma and Lakshmi, an entire pantheon of deities who would be welcomed into a landscape already alive with spirits, with nagas, serpent gods, who dwelled in the waters and who were believed to control rain and fertility. These water serpents were ancient in Cambodian belief, older than any foreign import, and when Hinduism arrived, the nagas were not displaced but rather incorporated, becoming guardians of Hindu temples, their images carved at the bases of stairways and along balustrades. Their mythological role expanded to include new narratives from Indian epics. The locals believed in ancestors too, in the need to venerate those who had died, to make offerings that would ensure their goodwill and prevent them from becoming malevolent ghosts. This ancestor worship did not conflict with Hindu practice but rather merged with it, the Hindu rituals providing new and more elaborate ways to honor the dead, the concept of merit-making, through donations and temple construction, providing a framework for understanding how the living could help the dead achieve better rebirths. What emerged was not Indian culture transplanted, but something new, a synthesis that drew on both traditions but was reducible to neither. The local people absorbed these foreign ideas and transformed them, blending Hindu cosmology with indigenous beliefs about water spirits and sacred mountains, creating a religious landscape that was neither purely Hindu nor purely animist, but rather a magnificent fusion that would find its ultimate expression in stone. The Brahmin priests who came from India found employment at the courts of local chiefs, performing rituals that legitimized their authority, teaching them Sanskrit so they could issue inscriptions that proclaimed their power in the language of the gods. These inscriptions were carved on stone pillars called steels, erected at important sites, recording donations to temples, victories in battle, the genealogies of ruling families. The language was Sanskrit, but the script used to write it was adapted from Indian models to suit the sounds of the local Khmer language, creating a unique writing system that could express both the sacred language of religion and the vernacular language of daily life. By the 6th and 7th centuries, several small kingdoms had emerged in this region, places with names like Chenla and Funan, ruling from wooden palaces that have left no trace, worshipping in brick temples that hint at the grandeur to come. These early kingdoms were not the vast centralized states that would develop later, but rather loose confederations, networks of allegiance between chiefs who acknowledged the supremacy of a paramount ruler, but who maintained considerable autonomy in their own territories. The paramount ruler would receive tribute, rice and fish and forest products, and in return would provide protection, would organize defense against external threats, would sponsor religious ceremonies that benefited the entire realm. The relationship was personal and often unstable, dependent on the strength and charisma of the ruler, subject to frequent challenges and succession disputes when a king died and his sons and brothers competed for the throne. These early kingdoms understood something fundamental about power in this landscape. Control over water meant control over rice production. Control over rice production meant the ability to support large populations, to feed armies, to free a class of people from farming so they could become artists, priests, soldiers, bureaucrats. Water was not just a resource, it was the foundation of everything, the source of life and power, and the early kings who could harness it, who could build embankments and channels to distribute it according to their will, were demonstrating a kind of divine authority, proving they could command the same forces that the gods controlled. The earliest water management projects were modest, small dams across streams, simple canals leading to fields, but they established the principle that would be elaborated over the following centuries into the most sophisticated hydraulic systems the pre-industrial world had ever seen. The spiritual landscape of pre-Angkorian Cambodia was rich and complex, a layered reality in which the visible world of trees and rivers and mountains was shot through with invisible presences, spirits and gods and ancestors who had to be acknowledged, propitiated, honored. Every hill was potentially sacred, every spring a dwelling place of spirits, every ancient tree a connection to the ancestors. When Hindu concepts arrived, they did not replace these beliefs, but rather organized them, gave them a cosmic framework that made sense of the relationships between different types of spiritual beings, between gods and spirits, between the sacred and the profane. The universe, according to Hindu-Buddhist cosmology, was arranged as a series of nested circles and squares, with Mount Meru, the sacred mountain, at the absolute center. At the summit of Meru dwelled the gods, Indra and his court in a celestial city of unimaginable splendor, while around its base stretched the continents of the mortal world, 4 main continents oriented to the cardinal directions, surrounded in turn by 7 concentric oceans, separated by 7 mountain ranges, the whole cosmological structure floating in an infinite cosmic ocean. This was not merely a myth, it was a map of reality, a description of how the universe actually was structured, and if you were a king claiming divine authority, what better way to prove it than to build a replica of Mount Meru itself, to create heaven on earth, to demonstrate that your capital was not merely a city, but the actual center of the cosmos. This idea, this audacious ambition to make the divine physically manifest in stone, would drive the construction of temples for the next 6 centuries, each king trying to create a more perfect representation, a more accurate recreation, a structure that would collapse the distance between the earthly and the heavenly, that would serve as a meeting place where gods and humans could interact, where the divine power that sustained the universe could be accessed and channeled for the benefit of the kingdom. The climate here shaped everything, determined the rhythm of life, the pattern of work and rest, the very architecture of buildings and cities. During the dry season, from November to April, the land baked under a merciless sun, rivers shrank, their wide beds reduced to narrow channels, threading between exposed sandbars, ponds dried to cracked mud, where fish bones bleached white in the heat, and dust hung in the air, coating everything with a fine grey powder that got into clothes and hair and food, that made breathing unpleasant and turned the inside of your nose and throat dry and scratchy. This was the season for building, when armies of workers could move stone and dig foundations without being mired in mud, when the rivers were low enough to expose the sandstone bedrock that could be quarried, when the roads were passable and heavy loads could be dragged on sledges across the hard earth. The work was brutal, beginning before dawn when the air was still relatively cool, pausing during the worst heat of midday, when even the most driven taskmaster would not demand labor, resuming in the late afternoon, and extending into the evening by the light of torches when deadlines pressed and the king's demands could not be denied. Then, usually in late May or early June, the first rains would arrive, tentative at first, a few scattered storms that brought hope and relief but not yet the full transformation. You could feel the anticipation in these weeks, see it in how people scanned the southern sky for the telltale buildup of clouds, hear it in conversations that centered on whether this was the true beginning or just a false start, a brief burst that would be followed by more dry weeks. But gradually the storms became more frequent, the gaps between them shorter, and by July the monsoon was in full force, a daily rhythm of afternoon thunderstorms that drenched the earth and filled every depression with water. The transformation was complete. Fields that had been brown stubble became vast expanses of bright green rice shoots, their color so vivid it almost hurt to look at them. The Tonle Sap swelled to its maximum extent, the water advancing across the floodplain so that villages that had been on high ground became islands, accessible only by boat. Roads became impassable, deep mud that could swallow a cart to its axles, that made walking exhausting and hazardous. This was the season when the world belonged to the water, when the only way to travel was by boat, when the temples rose like islands from a flooded landscape, their stone foundations lapped by the advancing waters, their courtyards transformed into shallow ponds where fish swam and water plants grew. The sound of water was everywhere, rain drumming on roofs and on the surface of ponds, running in impromptu streams along every slight depression, dripping from eaves and trees, a constant background noise that became so familiar you stopped consciously hearing it. The smell of wet earth and growing things, of vegetation releasing its scent in the humidity, of flowers blooming in response to the moisture, filled the air with a richness that was almost overwhelming, so different from the dry, dusty smell of the hot season that it seemed like you had entered a different world. The annual cycle of drought and deluge was the heartbeat of the civilization, the rhythm to which everything else had to conform, and the kings who could mediate this relationship, who could build the reservoirs that held water through the dry months and the channels that distributed it during planting season, were performing a sacred duty, acting as intermediaries between heaven and earth, between the will of the gods who sent the rain and the needs of the people who depended on it for survival. This was not a metaphor but a literal truth in the minds of the people of that time. The king's power to command the construction of dams and canals was directly analogous to the god's power to command the rain, and a king who could create a vast reservoir was demonstrating that he possessed divine attributes. that he was not merely a human ruler but something more, something that partook of both mortal and immortal natures. In the year 802, a king named Jayavarman II performed a ceremony on a mountain called Phnom Kulen, about 30 miles northeast of where Angkor would later stand. The details of this ceremony have been lost to time, but its significance was recorded in inscriptions carved centuries later, and from these fragmentary references we can piece together something of what happened. On that mountain, which was itself considered sacred, where springs emerged from the rock, and where the stone had been shaped by human hands into lingams and other ritual objects, Jayavarman declared himself a Devaraja, a god-king, establishing once and for all the principle that would define Cambodian kingship for the next 400 years. He was not merely ruling by divine right, claiming that the gods approved of his reign or that he governed with their blessing. He was not simply asserting that his authority came from heaven and should therefore be obeyed. He was asserting something far more radical and transformative, that he himself was a manifestation of the divine, that the god Shiva dwelled within him, that his body was a temporary housing for an immortal essence, that to honor the king was to honor the god, and to build a temple to house the king's sacred essence was to create a dwelling place for heaven itself. This was an enormously powerful idea, one that justified the massive expenditure of resources that temple building required, one that transformed construction from a civic project into a religious obligation, one that meant that every stone dragged from distant quarries, every hour spent carving intricate reliefs, every life lost in the dangerous work of moving multi-ton blocks was not merely labor but worship, an act of devotion that would earn merit in this life and the next, that would benefit not just the king but the workers themselves, improving their karma and ensuring better rebirths. Jayavarman II moved his capital several times during his reign, never quite settling, perhaps searching for the perfect location, the place where the spiritual geography aligned with practical considerations of defense and water access, where the forces of earth and heaven intersected in ways that would maximize his power and ensure the prosperity of his realm. Each time he moved, he built temples, though none that survive in more than fragmentary form, establishing the pattern that his successors would follow with ever-increasing ambition. These early temples were experimental in a sense, working out the architectural vocabulary that would later be refined to perfection, testing different arrangements of towers and galleries, different methods of construction, different symbolic programs in the carvings and inscriptions. What he created was not just a kingdom but a template, a model for how divine kingship should function, how the relationship between ruler and ruled should be mediated through stone and ritual, through the construction of sacred spaces that made the invisible visible, that gave physical form to theological concepts. The temple was not merely a place of worship in the sense that we might understand it, not a building where people gathered for communal prayer or where sermons were preached. Instead, it was conceived as a dwelling place for the god, a palace in which the divine resided and from which divine power radiated outward to sustain the kingdom. The king, as the embodiment of the god, was the primary actor in the rituals performed there, and ordinary people were not participants, but rather witnesses to these cosmic dramas, observers of ceremonies they could barely understand, but which they knew were essential to maintaining the order of the universe. When Jayavarman died, probably around 850, he left behind a unified kingdom, a religious framework, and an expectation that would drive his successors to build on a scale that still seems almost impossible today. The kings who followed him each sought to demonstrate their devotion, their divine status, their worthiness to rule, by constructing their own temple mountains, their own representations of Mount Meru, their own connections to the heavenly realm. This competitive temple building would become the central political and religious activity of the Khmer state, consuming vast resources but also creating the monuments that would define the civilization, that would proclaim its greatness to the world, that would endure long after the kingdom itself had vanished. The early temples were modest compared to what would come later, but they established principles that would endure. They were built on elevated platforms, raising them above the floodwaters and symbolically lifting them closer to heaven, creating an artificial mountain where no natural mountain existed, imposing human will on the flat landscape. They faced east, toward the rising sun, toward renewal and rebirth, toward the direction from which the gods approached the world each morning. And entering a temple meant walking toward the light, moving from darkness to illumination, a physical journey that mirrored the spiritual journey from ignorance to knowledge. They were constructed primarily of brick and laterite, a reddish iron-rich stone that hardens when exposed to air, with sandstone reserved for the most important carvings and doorframes, for the elements that required the finest detail and would be most closely observed. The basic form was a tower, the prasat, representing the peak of Mount Meru, often surrounded by smaller towers, representing the lesser peaks that surrounded the cosmic mountain, all enclosed by walls that symbolized the mountain ranges separating the continents, all surrounded in turn by a moat that represented the cosmic ocean. Within the central tower, accessible only to the highest priests and to the king himself, was a dark sanctum, the garbhagriha or womb chamber, a space so sacred that to enter it uninvited was not just forbidden but spiritually dangerous, risking the anger of the god and the disruption of cosmic forces that kept the universe in balance. In this chamber resided the sacred linga of Shiva, a stylized phallus carved from stone, often black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, representing the god's creative power, the generative force that sustained the universe, that created and created again in an endless cycle. This linga was not merely symbolic. It was understood to be the actual presence of the god, a physical manifestation of divine power, and the rituals performed around it were designed to activate and channel that power, to ensure its continued flow into the kingdom and the king. Water would be poured over it in endless libations, running down channels carved in the pedestal and flowing out through a spout oriented to the north, the direction associated with Shiva, and this water, having touched the god, having absorbed some measure of divine essence, became sacred, became a medium through which blessings could be conveyed to the people. The chamber would smell of old incense and damp stone, and the particular sweetness of the flowers used in offerings, a scent that spoke of centuries of ritual, of countless priests performing the same actions in the same space, wearing grooves in the floor with their feet, darkening the walls with the smoke of their lamps, creating through repetition a place so saturated with devotion that the very stones seemed to hum with spiritual energy. As the 9th century progressed, successive kings built their own temple mountains, each trying to outdo his predecessor, each claiming a closer connection to the divine, each seeking to create a structure that would serve as their eternal monument, the place where their ashes would be enshrined, and where future generations would make offerings to ensure their continued spiritual progress. Indravarman I built the temple of Priya Kao, dedicated to his ancestors, and the larger temple mountain of Bakong, which still stands as one of the earliest examples of the form fully realized. A 5-tiered pyramid surmounted by a tower, its stairs steep and its symbolism clear, an artificial mountain rising from the plain, visible for miles around, a statement of power and piety that could not be ignored. These were not isolated structures, but parts of larger complexes that included libraries, long halls where sacred texts were kept and read, where the scriptures written on palm leaf manuscripts were stored in conditions as dry as possible to prevent the rot that constantly threatened organic materials in this humid climate. There were artificial lakes called barays that served both practical and symbolic purposes, storing water for irrigation but also representing the cosmic ocean, creating a landscape that mirrored the theological geography of Hindu cosmology. There were surrounding walls with monumental gateways oriented to the cardinal directions, each gateway a structure in itself, a tower through which one passed from the profane world outside to the sacred space within. The temples were not meant to be entered by common people. They were the exclusive domain of the king, the royal family, and the Brahmin priests who performed the elaborate rituals required to maintain cosmic order, who knew the mantras and gestures that activated divine power, who could read Sanskrit and perform the complex ceremonies that took hours or even days to complete. For the vast majority of the population, these stone mountains were distant objects of awe, places they might glimpse from afar during festivals, structures that dominated the skyline and demonstrated the power and piety of their ruler, physical proof that they lived in a kingdom favored by the gods, protected by forces beyond human comprehension. The construction of these temples required an enormous investment of resources and labor, a mobilization of the entire kingdom's productive capacity for years or even decades. Sandstone, the primary building material for the finest structures, had to be quarried from Phnom Kulen and other sites, sometimes 40 or 50 miles away, distance that seems modest by modern standards, but that represented a formidable challenge in an age when all transport was by human or animal power. The quarries themselves were sacred places where prayers were offered before cutting stone, where the first blow of the chisel was a ritual act, where the workers understood themselves to be extracting not mere building material but the substance from which the divine would be manifested. The blocks, some weighing several tons, were moved by methods we can only partially reconstruct from the evidence that remains. They likely used wooden rollers, cylinders of hard wood cut from the forest and placed under the blocks, allowing them to be pushed or pulled with less friction than dragging them directly across the ground. Teams of workers, perhaps hundreds for the largest blocks, would pull on ropes made from plant fibers, twisted and braided to create cables strong enough to handle the load, working in coordinated rhythm, moving the block a few inches or feet at a time, resting when exhaustion made further effort impossible, resuming when strength returned. They perhaps used elephants for the heaviest pieces, harnessing the great strength of these animals who could pull loads no human team could move, though controlling elephants required special skills, and the animals themselves had to be carefully managed to prevent injury to them or to the workers. During the flood season, when the rising water made river transport possible, they would build rafts, lashing logs together to create floating platforms on which the stones could be loaded, then guiding these unwieldy craft down rivers and canals, using poles and paddles and ropes tied to trees along the shore to control their movement, preventing them from running aground or being swept away by currents. This was dangerous work. Rafts could capsize, dumping their precious cargo into the river where it might be lost forever or might be recoverable only with immense effort. Workers could fall into the water and drown, pulled under by the current or trapped beneath a shifting load. But the work continued because the alternative, leaving the stones at the quarry, abandoning the temple project, was unthinkable, would represent a failure of duty to the god and the king, would risk divine displeasure and the catastrophes that might follow. At the construction site, the blocks were fitted together without mortar, using only their weight and precise cutting to hold them in place. The skill required for this was extraordinary, representing the culmination of knowledge passed down through generations of masons, refined through trial and error, jealously guarded as professional secrets. The masons who shaped these stones had to work them to tolerances measured in millimeters, ensuring that the weight distributed evenly, that the pressures balanced, that the towers could rise story by story without collapsing, that the corbelled arches spanning the galleries, built by progressively projecting courses of stone until they met in the middle, would hold for centuries. They worked with iron tools, chisels and hammers, slowly pecking away at the sandstone's surface, removing material grain by grain, testing the fit constantly, making minute adjustments, creating not just structural elements but art. The decorative program that covered every available surface was not random or merely aesthetic. Every image told a story, reinforced a theological point, demonstrated the king's learning and piety. The walls were covered with depictions of gods and goddesses, each figure shown in the prescribed iconographic form, recognizable by their attributes, the number of their arms, the objects they held, the vehicles they rode. There were scenes from the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, narratives that had been told and retold for centuries, but that here were given permanent form in stone, the stories unfolding across panels and around corners, meant to be read in sequence by those who had been taught their meanings. There were celestial dancers called apsaras who moved in eternal grace, their bodies shown in impossible poses, triple bent with hips thrust to one side and shoulders to the other, their hands forming mudras, ritual gestures, each finger precisely positioned to convey specific meanings. There were battles between gods and demons, cosmic conflicts in which the fate of the universe hung in the balance, depicted with all the violence and energy of the narratives, swords raised, bodies falling, elephants trampling, the stone alive with frozen movement. There was the churning of the ocean of milk, that great creation myth in which gods and demons worked together, temporarily setting aside their enmity to achieve a common purpose, using the serpent Vasuki as a rope wrapped around Mount Mandara, pulling back and forth in a cosmic tug-of-war that released the elixir of immortality and other precious substances from the depths of the primordial ocean. These stories were not entertainment in our sense. They were scripture made visible, sacred texts that could be read by anyone who had been taught their meanings. a visual theology that proclaimed the temple's purpose and the king's role in maintaining the cosmic order. The carvers who created these reliefs were not anonymous laborers but skilled artisans, many of whom likely specialized in particular subjects, passing their knowledge from master to apprentice across generations, developing regional styles that we can still identify today in the subtle differences between temples built in different eras or different locations. Some specialized in apsaras, becoming expert at rendering the complex poses and elaborate jewelry and headdresses. Others focused on narrative scenes, mastering the ability to show multiple figures in dynamic interaction, creating compositions that guided the eye through the story. Still others were specialists in decorative elements, the floral motifs and geometric patterns that filled spaces between the narrative panels, creating visual rhythm and unity across large expanses of wall. Now imagine yourself walking through one of these temple complexes on an ordinary day in the 10th century, when they were functioning as they were intended to function, not yet silent and abandoned, but alive with purpose and activity, humming with the energy of countless people engaged in the work of maintaining the divine order. You approach from the east, the auspicious direction, the direction of sunrise and new beginnings, following a long causeway that crosses over a wide moat. The water in the moat is dark and still, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a fish rising to take an insect, reflecting the sky and the stone walls that rise beyond it like a mirror of the heavens. This moat is not merely decorative, not simply a defensive barrier or a source of water for irrigation. It represents the cosmic ocean, the primordial waters that surrounded the continents of the world in Hindu cosmology, and crossing it means leaving the profane world behind, entering sacred space where different rules apply, where the boundary between human and divine becomes permeable, where the impossible becomes possible. You feel this transition even if you cannot articulate it, a subtle shift in atmosphere, a sense that you are entering somewhere important, somewhere that demands respect and careful behavior. At the end of the causeway stands a gopura, a monumental gateway tower, its walls thick and solid, its passage shadowed and cool after the glare of the sun on the water. The walls of the gopura are carved with images of guardian deities, fierce figures with multiple arms holding weapons, their faces stern and watchful, meant to repel evil spirits and those who approach with impure intentions. As you pass through, you feel the temperature drop, the thick stone walls blocking the sun, creating a pocket of relative coolness, and your footsteps echo slightly in the enclosed space, the sound bouncing off the walls and ceiling, announcing your arrival. As you emerge on the far side, you blink in the sudden brightness and find yourself in an outer courtyard, a vast open space surrounded by galleries with colonnaded walkways. The ground here is hard-packed earth, swept clean each morning by temple servants who rise before dawn to perform this task, removing fallen leaves and blossoms, smoothing away footprints, creating a blank surface for the day's activities. The heat radiates up from this ground in waves that make the air shimmer, that create mirages at the edges of your vision, that make distant objects seem to float and waver. Despite the heat, there is activity everywhere. You see priests moving between buildings, their white garments bright against the dark stone, their heads shaved and their upper bodies bare in the traditional style, their skin gleaming with sweat. They walk with purpose, carrying bronze vessels filled with water for libations, baskets of flowers and fruit for offerings, rolled palm leaf manuscripts containing the texts they will read during ceremonies. The sounds here are unlike anything in the secular world outside. There is the low chanting of priests, a rhythmic murmur in Sanskrit that rises and falls in complex patterns, sometimes a single voice, sometimes multiple voices in unison, creating a sonic texture that seems to vibrate in your chest, that resonates in the stone around you. There is the clash of small cymbals, a bright metallic sound that punctuates the chanting, marking the rhythm of the ritual, calling the attention of the gods to the offerings being made. There is the drone of a stringed instrument, something like a vina, its notes long and sustained, creating a harmonic bed over which the chanting floats. This music serves not to entertain, but to create a sacred atmosphere, to mark the time and space as different from ordinary experience, to help both performers and witnesses enter the proper mental state for approaching the divine. There is the smell of incense, thick and sweet, sandalwood and jasmine and other scents you cannot identify. smoke rising in lazy spirals from bronze vessels placed at regular intervals around the courtyard, from the censers carried by priests, from the sticks planted in sand-filled bowls near shrines. The smoke catches the light, becomes visible as it rises, creating columns and streams that shift with the slightest breeze. The scent is everywhere, inescapable, clinging to your clothes and hair, entering your lungs with every breath, becoming part of you as you become part of this place. You smell too the flowers used in offerings, frangipani and lotus blossoms, their natural perfume mixing with the incense to create a complex bouquet that speaks of devotion and beauty, of things offered freely to the gods with no expectation of return except perhaps merit, spiritual advancement, a better rebirth in the endless cycle of existence. You see dancers, young women training in the classical forms, their movements slow and deliberate, each gesture of hand and foot carrying specific meaning, their bodies telling stories in a language of pure motion. They are training in one of the open galleries, their teacher watching critically, occasionally stopping them to correct a position, to demonstrate the proper angle of a wrist or the exact height a foot should be raised. These dancers will eventually perform in temple ceremonies, their movements offerings as important as flowers or incense, their bodies instruments through which cosmic stories are enacted, through which the gods are praised and the order of the universe maintained. You can hear the rhythm being clapped by their teacher, a steady beat that they must follow exactly, and you can see the concentration on their faces, the effort required to make these complex movements appear effortless, natural, divine. You see artisans at work even now, even after the temple's main construction is complete, touching up carvings damaged by the weather, applying fresh paint to reliefs that were never meant to be the bare grey stone we see today, but were originally brilliant with color. The paint they use is made from mineral pigments, ground to powder and mixed with binding agents, reds from iron oxides, blues from imported lapis lazuli or local azurite, yellows from orpiment, whites from lime, greens from mixing blues and yellows. They apply these colors carefully with brushes made from plant fibers, following patterns that have been established by tradition, ensuring that each god appears in the proper colors, that each element of the composition reads clearly even from a distance. The effect, when fresh, would have been dazzling, the stone transformed into something like a jewel box, every surface alive with color and pattern, very different from the romantic weathered appearance that appeals to modern sensibilities, but that would have seemed sad and neglected to those who built these structures. As you move deeper into the complex, passing through successive courtyards and galleries, the architecture becomes more elaborate, the carvings more dense, the atmosphere more charged with sanctity. You reach the final enclosure wall, taller and thicker than the outer walls, its gates more heavily guarded, both physically by temple servants who check that those entering have the proper status, and spiritually by the carved images of protectors that line the passage. Beyond this wall rises the central tower, the praset, tall and steep-sided, its summit crowned with a lotus bud finial that seems to pierce the sky, to connect earth and heaven in a single vertical thrust. The tower's surface is entirely covered with carvings, tier upon tier of them, creating a visual density that is almost overwhelming, that demands slow observation, that rewards hours of careful study with the discovery of new details, new narratives, new theological insights. There are niches at regular intervals, each holding a statue of a guardian deity, the figures carved in high relief so they seem almost to step out from the wall. There are false windows with delicate stone tracery, intricate patterns that suggest the wooden shutters of actual buildings but rendered in stone and therefore permanent, unchanging, eternal. There are decorative moldings that create patterns of light and shadow as the sun moves across the sky, the deep undercuts catching the light, the surfaces angled to reflect or absorb, creating a constantly changing appearance that makes the tower seem alive, responsive to the cosmos, participating in the daily cycle of light and darkness that structures all existence. Steep stairs lead up the tower's face, each step so high and narrow that you must climb on hands and knees, gripping the warm stone, feeling its texture under your palms, aware of the drop below you if you should lose your grip. This is not poor design but deliberate symbolism, a physical humbling, a reminder that you are approaching the dwelling place of the divine and must do so with appropriate reverence, with your body low and your heart open. The climb is exhausting in the heat, your muscles burning, your breath coming hard, sweat running into your eyes and making your hands slippery. But you continue because to turn back would be to admit defeat, to fail in your devotion, to demonstrate insufficient commitment to the spiritual journey the architecture is guiding you through. Only the highest-ranking priests are allowed to enter the central sanctum at the tower's heart. You, as an ordinary visitor or even as a nobleman, must stop at the outer threshold, peering into the darkness but not crossing it, respecting the boundary that separates the accessible from the forbidden. Inside, in near total darkness, broken only by the flicker of butter lamps, their flames small and steady, casting moving shadows on the walls, stands the linga, carved from a single block of stone, often black basalt, that absorbs rather than reflects light, making it seem less like an object than like a whole in reality, a point of infinite density around which everything else orients. The linga rises from a pedestal called a yoni, representing the female principle, the creative matrix, the two together symbolizing the union of opposites that generates existence, male and female, active and passive, heaven and earth. Water is poured over the linga in endless libations, the liquid running down the smooth stone, following channels carved in the pedestal, collecting in a reservoir before flowing out through a spout oriented to the north, the direction associated with Shiva, the direction from which he is believed to observe the world. The water that has touched the linga is sacred, charged with divine power, and is collected in special vessels and distributed to the faithful as a blessing, a tangible connection to the God who dwells in stone, a substance that bridges the gap between matter and spirit, between the visible and invisible worlds. The chamber smells of old incense and stone and water, a scent that speaks of centuries of ritual even in a relatively new temple, of countless priests performing the same actions in the same space, wearing grooves in the floor with their feet, darkening the walls with the smoke of their lamps, creating through repetition a place so saturated with devotion that the very stones seem to hum with spiritual energy, that the air feels thick with presence, with the accumulated force of prayers and offerings spanning generations. To stand at this threshold, even if you cannot enter, is to feel that you are in proximity to something vast and ancient, something that existed before you were born and will continue after you die. Something to which your individual existence is almost insignificant, yet in which you participate simply by being here, by witnessing, by offering your presence as a kind of prayer. Outside the temple complex, the city spreads in all directions, though calling it a city requires some adjustment of expectations, if you are accustomed to the stone-built urban landscapes of Europe or the Middle East. There are no stone buildings here for ordinary people, no grand boulevards paved with cut stone, no public squares in the sense of open plazas surrounded by civic structures. The city is built almost entirely of wood and thatch, materials that have long since returned to the earth, leaving almost no trace for archaeologists to find, so that our knowledge of what these cities looked like comes primarily from carvings that show buildings, from the accounts of Chinese visitors who described what they saw, and from the patterns of slight elevations and depressions in the ground that mark where buildings once stood. The houses stand on stilts to lift them above the floods that come every year without fail, wooden posts driven into the ground and supporting platforms on which the living quarters rest, typically a single large room that serves all purposes, sleeping and cooking and working and storing possessions. The walls, when there are walls, are made of woven bamboo matting that allows air to circulate, essential in the heat, or sometimes of wooden planks if the householder can afford them. The roof is thatch, palm fronds laid in overlapping rows that shed water effectively when properly maintained, but that must be replaced every few years as they dry and crack, as wind tears them loose, as they rot from the constant humidity. The houses are connected by raised wooden walkways that allow movement during the flood season, and by paths of hard-packed dirt during the dry months, these paths winding between buildings in patterns that seem organic rather than planned, following slight rises in the ground, avoiding low areas that become impassable mud during rains, creating a labyrinth that locals navigate with ease, but that would utterly confuse a stranger. Each household has its space, its garden plot where vegetables grow in the rich soil, bitter melons and eggplants and various greens, and where fruit trees provide shade and produce, mangoes and tamarinds and the ubiquitous coconut palms whose every part has a use, from the meat and milk of the nuts to the fronds that become thatch, from the fiber of the husk that becomes rope to the sap that can be fermented into a mildly alcoholic drink. The animals are everywhere, chickens pecking in the dirt for insects and seeds, their soft clucking a constant background sound, Pigs rooting under the houses where the shade keeps them cool, occasionally grunting or squealing when they fight over food or when they are disturbed. Water buffalo, massive and patient, stand in shallow ponds or in the shade of trees, their broad backs often hosting egrets who pick parasites from their skin in a mutually beneficial relationship. Dogs, thin and wary, scavenge for scraps, tolerated because they bark at strangers and help keep other predators away from the chickens. The population density is surprisingly low compared to medieval European cities, with houses spreading across a vast area rather than clustering tightly together. A pattern made possible by the abundance of rice, the staple crop that could support large populations from relatively modest fields, thanks to the irrigation systems that allowed multiple harvests per year. The true wealth of this civilization is not in its cities but in its rice paddies, in the endless green fields that surround the urban core, in the water management systems that allow such intensive agriculture, in the surplus that makes possible a class of non-farmers who can be priests or soldiers or artisans or the workers who build temples, who are freed from the necessity of producing their own food and can therefore devote their lives to specialized occupations. The people who live in these wooden houses go about lives that would be recognizable to rural Southeast Asians. Even today, the basic patterns of existence shaped more by climate and geography than by the passage of centuries. They rise before dawn, before the heat becomes oppressive, when the air is still relatively cool and fresh, when the light filtering through the trees is soft and gray. They eat a simple breakfast, rice left over from the previous night's meal, perhaps with some fish paste, then head to their work, to the fields if they are farmers, to their workshops if they are craftsmen, to the river if they are fishermen. They eat rice as the foundation of every meal, white rice boiled in water until it becomes soft and sticky, filling and satisfying, its bland flavor a perfect backdrop for the strongly flavored accompaniments. These accompaniments might include fish, fresh or dried or fermented into that pungent paste that is both loved and hated, depending on your familiarity with it, grilled over coals or stewed in soups. They eat vegetables, whatever is in season, cooked in various ways, stir-fried with garlic and chili, boiled in broths, pickled for preservation. They eat fruit when it is available, mangoes so ripe the juice runs down your chin, bananas of a dozen different varieties, each with its own flavor and texture, papayas and pineapples, and the infamous durian, loved for its creamy texture and complex flavor, hated for its overwhelming smell. They dress simply, the common people in lengths of cloth wrapped around the waist and between the legs to form a kind of trouser, bare-chested in the heat, because any more clothing would be unbearable, going barefoot because shoes would quickly rot in the wet conditions, and are unnecessary on ground that is generally soft earth or sand. The wealthy dress more elaborately, in finer fabrics, sometimes imported silk from China that shimmers with color and texture, sometimes cotton dyed in bright colors using local plants, saffron yellows and deep indigos and rich reds. They wear jewelry, gold and silver worked into bracelets and anklets and necklaces, signs of wealth and status that can be displayed without words. They may wear shoes, simple sandals with wooden soles and fabric straps, protecting their feet and marking them as people who do not labor in fields or workshops. They live under the protection and authority of the God King, though most will never see him except perhaps at a distance during great festivals, and their daily lives are governed more by the rhythm of planting and harvest, of flood and drought, than by the decrees of distant monarchs. They owe labor service to the state, corvée obligations that can be called upon for temple construction or military campaigns or the maintenance of irrigation systems, but for most of the year they are left to manage their own affairs, to farm their own fields, to engage in their own trade, to live lives that are shaped more by family and community than by the demands of government. The temple complexes are not just religious centers but economic ones as well. They own vast tracts of land worked by people who owe service to the temple rather than directly to the king, though the distinction is often murky since the king is himself a manifestation of the god the temple serves, making every division between royal and religious authority somewhat artificial, every attempt to separate church and state meaningless in a world where they are fundamentally the same thing. The temples employ not just priests but dancers and musicians who perform in ceremonies, craftsmen who maintain the structures and create new objects for ritual use, guards who protect the compounds and control access. administrators who manage the temple's estates and ensure that tribute flows from the countryside to the central complex. There are scribes who keep records on palm leaf manuscripts, writing in careful script with iron styluses that incise the letters into the prepared leaf surface, which is then rubbed with carbon to make the writing visible, creating documents that will survive for decades before the humid climate causes them to rot and crumble, requiring them to be copied onto fresh leaves to preserve their contents. These scribes record donations and land grants, the names of donors and the specific gifts they have made, the terms under which temple land is held and worked, the obligations owed by those who live on temple estates. The temples receive offerings of food and flowers daily, rice and fruit and coconuts, jasmine and lotus blossoms, accumulating resources that are redistributed to support this entire ecosystem of religious activity. On festival days, the distribution becomes more elaborate, with rice and cloth and other goods given out to maintain networks of patronage and loyalty, to demonstrate the temple's and therefore the king's generosity, to reinforce the social order through acts of controlled giving that create obligations and dependencies, that bind people to the temple and through it to the king. The relationship is understood as reciprocal, not merely hierarchical. The people give their labor and their offerings, the temple provides spiritual benefits and material support, the king ensures prosperity and cosmic order, each element dependent on the others, the whole system balanced in ways that seem natural to those within it, even as they appear complex and sometimes contradictory to outside observers. The festivals themselves are spectacular affairs that transform the temple complex and the surrounding area into a stage for cosmic drama. Imagine yourself present on the day of a great royal ceremony, perhaps the annual festival celebrating the temple's consecration, when the king himself will make offerings at the central shrine and renew the sacred contract between the divine and the earthly realms. Days in advance, the entire complex has been cleaned and decorated with an intensity that goes far beyond the daily maintenance. Fresh flowers have been placed in every niche and on every altar, their fragrance mixing with incense to create an almost overwhelming olfactory experience. New flags have been hung from the towers, silk banners in bright colors that snap and flutter in the breeze, visible from great distances, announcing that something extraordinary is about to occur. The courtyards have been swept until not a leaf or twig remains, and in some areas, decorative patterns have been created using colored sands or flower petals, temporary mandalas that will be destroyed by the first footstep but that demonstrate the commitment to beauty and perfection that characterizes these occasions. On the morning of the ceremony, you join the crowds gathering outside the outer walls, commoners who have come from the surrounding countryside, to witness this rare event when the divine will manifest in human form, when the boundaries between heaven and earth will become permeable, when blessings will flow with particular intensity. The air vibrates with anticipation, with the sound of drums and gongs being tuned and tested, with the chanting of prayers that has already begun in the inner sanctuaries, with the murmur of thousands of voices, people greeting friends and relatives they have not seen since the last great festival, sharing news and gossip, eating snacks purchased from vendors who have set up stalls near the temple walls, creating a carnival atmosphere that coexists somehow with the profound religious solemnity of the occasion. Then a procession appears, emerging from the royal palace located some distance from the temple, moving slowly along the processional way that has been prepared for this moment, paved with fresh sand, lined with people who kneel as the procession passes. First come the musicians, men carrying large drums slung between poles, beating out a rhythm that seems to shake the ground, that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. A deep throbbing pulse that marks the sacred time, that distinguishes this moment from ordinary experience. Behind them come other musicians with gongs and cymbals, with wooden xylophones and wind instruments, creating a complex layered sound that is both cacophonous and strangely beautiful, music that serves not to entertain but to announce the presence of the divine, to create an acoustic environment that facilitates the transition from one mode of being to another. Then come dancers, women and girls who have trained for years in the classical forms, their movements now slow and deliberate, as befits this procession, their hands forming mudras that tell stories to those who can read them, their gold ornaments catching the morning light and flashing with each movement. They move in perfect synchronization, their steps measured to match the rhythm of the drums, their faces serene and slightly smiling with that particular expression that suggests they are no longer entirely present in their bodies, but have become instruments through which the divine expresses itself. Behind them come the high officials of the kingdom, wearing their marks of rank, elaborate headdresses and jewelry that indicate their position in the hierarchy, followed by Brahmin priests carrying ritual objects, bronze vessels and silk cloths and the implements required for the ceremony that will follow. And finally, surrounded by parasols of white silk that shield him from the direct sun, and by fans of peacock feathers that create a slight breeze in the still morning air, comes the king himself. He is carried on a golden palanquin, borne by specially selected bearers who have been trained to move with perfectly smooth steps, keeping the platform absolutely level regardless of the terrain. The king sits cross-legged on cushions, his posture erect and motionless, his face serene and distant, painted with white powder and decorated with gold leaf in patterns that mark him as the embodiment of Shiva. He wears a tall golden crown that rises in tiers, each tier decorated with jewels and intricate filigree work, the whole construction so heavy that it requires great neck strength to wear it for extended periods. He does not look at the crowds who press to catch a glimpse of him. He stares ahead, toward the temple, toward the divine realm where his true nature exists, his eyes focused on something beyond what ordinary mortals can see. The palanquin bearers move with careful steps, trained through endless practice to keep the platform perfectly level, even when walking on uneven ground. And as the procession passes, you and everyone around you prostrate yourselves, foreheads pressed to the ground, forbidden to look directly at the sacred presence, remaining in this position until the procession has moved far enough away that it is safe to rise. When you finally lift your head, the procession is approaching the temple's outer gateway, and even from this distance, you can see the flash of gold, can hear the music that continues unabated, can sense somehow the power of what is happening, the convergence of human and divine, earthly and celestial, temporal and eternal. When the king enters the temple, passing through the sequence of courtyards and towers, the common people are held back at the outer walls, but you can still hear the music, still smell the intensified scent of incense that billows out in clouds, still sense somehow the power of what is happening at the complex's heart. In the central sanctuary, in the dark chamber where the linga stands, the king will perform offerings that have been performed in essentially the same way for centuries, pouring water and milk over the sacred stone, presenting flowers and food, reciting Sanskrit verses that most people present do not fully understand, but whose power comes not from comprehension, but from perfect recitation, from the sounds themselves which are believed to have inherent efficacy, regardless of the listener's understanding. This ceremony serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It renews the king's divine status, demonstrating through ritual action that he is not merely a human ruler but a living god. It renews the cosmic order, the proper relationship between heaven and earth, ensuring that the forces that sustain the universe remain in balance. It renews the kingdom's prosperity, guaranteeing through sacred contract that the rains will come, that the harvests will be abundant, that enemies will be defeated, that all the benefits that flow from divine favor will continue for another cycle. And it renews the people's loyalty and faith, giving them a spectacle that confirms what they believe, that makes visible the theological claims on which the entire social order rests, that demonstrates beyond any doubt that they live in a sacred kingdom ruled by a sacred king, blessed by sacred powers. The architecture of these temples is deeply symbolic, every element chosen not for aesthetic reasons alone but for its theological meaning. The towers represent Mount Meru, yes, but the number of towers matters, often 3 or 5 representing different aspects of the divine or different levels of cosmic reality. The walls are not mere barriers but represent the mountain ranges that encircle the world. The moats are the oceans. The causeways crossing the moats are the rainbow bridges that connect earth to heaven. The entire complex is oriented with precise astronomical alignments, designed so that on certain days of the year, perhaps the spring equinox or the king's birthday, the rising sun will shine directly through a particular doorway and illuminate a specific image, a piece of celestial choreography that demonstrates the builder's mastery of both engineering and cosmology. The decoration serves similar symbolic purposes. The apsaras carved on the walls are not merely beautiful women but celestial beings whose dance maintains the universe's harmony. The makara, fantastic water creatures, with elephant trunks and crocodile bodies that appear as decorative elements on drainspouts and lintels, represent the fertilizing power of water, the source of all life. The Garudas, half-human, half-bird creatures, shown in fierce poses, represent the divine power that protects the temple from spiritual threats. The Nagas, multi-headed serpents that appear everywhere, coiling around balustrades and forming balustrades themselves, represent the water spirits indigenous to this land, incorporated into Hindu iconography as protectors and guardians. Their presence a reminder that this synthesis of Indian and local beliefs goes far deeper than surface adoption, that the Cambodians took foreign concepts and made them utterly their own. The stone itself carries meaning. Sandstone was valued not just for its workability but for its color, its texture, the way it aged and weathered, darkening to warm gray and gold tones, supporting the growth of lichens that created natural patterns on its surface. Laterite, that red stone used for foundations and less visible elements, was understood to represent earth, the solid foundation of reality. The carvings were not meant to be static but to change with the light, to create different effects at dawn when the sun rose behind the eastern towers and sent long shadows across the courtyards. At noon when the overhead sun eliminated almost all shadow and made the stone seem to glow from within. At sunset when the light came from the west and illuminated faces and figures that spent most of the day in shadow. At night during festivals when torches and lamps created flickering, dramatic lighting that made the carved figures seem to move, to breathe, to live. The hydraulic systems that supported this civilization were as impressive as the temples themselves and intimately connected to them. The barrays, enormous rectangular reservoirs, were the most visible expression of this technology. The West Barray, built in the 11th century, measured approximately 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers and could hold more than 50 million cubic meters of water when full. These were not natural lakes but entirely artificial constructions, requiring the excavation of millions of tons of earth, the building of massive earthen dikes to contain the water, the careful calculation of gradients to ensure that water could be released in controlled amounts to feed irrigation canals. The labor required to build such structures was immense, but the benefits were transformative. With reliable water supplies, farmers could produce 2 or even 3 rice crops per year instead of 1. Population grew. Surplus accumulated. The kingdom became wealthy beyond the dreams of its neighbors. But the barrays were not merely practical. They were religious architecture as well. Sacred lakes representing the cosmic oceans, sometimes with temple islands in their centers, representing Mount Meru rising from the waters. The water itself was considered purified by proximity to the temples, charged with spiritual power, and the act of building these vast reservoirs was understood as recreating the cosmos, as making the mythological landscape physically real. The king who could command the construction of a barray was demonstrating godlike power over the elements, proving his claim to divine status through works that only a god could accomplish. The irrigation network fed by these reservoirs was equally sophisticated. Channels and sluices distributed water across the landscape, allowing farmers to flood their fields at optimal times, to drain them when necessary, to manipulate the environment in ways that would have been impossible through natural rainfall alone. This was not a centralized system in the modern sense, with engineers calculating flow rates and adjusting valves from a central command center. Instead, it was a distributed network managed at multiple levels with local officials responsible for sections of canal, with customary laws determining who had rights to water when, with periodic labor obligations requiring farmers to maintain the channels and dikes that served their region. The system was robust because it was redundant, because no single point of failure could bring down the whole network, but it required constant maintenance, constant attention, constant labor to prevent channels from silting up, dikes from eroding, distribution points from becoming clogged with vegetation. The genius of this hydraulic civilization was recognizing that water was power in its most literal sense. Control the water, and you controlled food production. Control food production, and you could support the armies, the priesthood, the artisan class, the administrators who made a complex kingdom function. The temples and the water systems were 2 faces of the same project, the religious and the practical merging into a single expression of royal authority. When a king built a new temple mountain, he also built or expanded the water systems that surrounded it, and both actions demonstrated the same thing, that he possessed the power to reshape the world according to divine principles, to impose order on chaos, to guarantee prosperity through his unique relationship with the gods. As the 10th century gave way to the 11th, the pace and scale of temple construction accelerated. Kings competed not just with their neighbors but with their own ancestors, each trying to build something larger, more elaborate, more theologically sophisticated than anything that had come before. The royal capital moved several times, each king wanting to establish his own seat of power, his own temple mountain, his own mark on the landscape that would endure for eternity. Then in the early 12th century, a king came to power who would build the most ambitious temple ever attempted, a structure so vast, so perfectly executed, so rich in symbolic meaning that it would become not just the culmination of the Khmer architectural tradition, but one of the supreme achievements of human civilization. His name was Surya Varman II, and his temple would be called Angkor Wat. The name means city temple, and while it is not technically a city, the scale is such that the term is not entirely inappropriate. The complex covers an area of over 200 hectares, surrounded by a moat nearly 5 kilometers in circumference, enclosing a space larger than many medieval European towns. Imagine approaching it from the west, the direction we usually associate with death and endings, but which Surya Varman deliberately chose, perhaps because he intended this temple to serve as his mausoleum, the place where his ashes would be enshrined, and his divine essence worshipped for eternity. The Western orientation marking it as a temple of the dead, a place where the boundary between this world and the next became especially thin. You cross a broad moat, 200 meters wide at its narrowest point, its water surface dark and still, reflecting the temple's towers so perfectly that it becomes difficult to distinguish the real from the reflection, the solid from the illusory. The water is home to fish and turtles, to water plants that float on the surface or grow from the muddy bottom, to birds that wade along the edges looking for frogs and small fish. The moat serves practical purposes, storing water for irrigation, providing fish for food, creating a barrier against fire that might otherwise spread from the wooden city surrounding the temple. But its primary purpose is symbolic, representing the cosmic ocean that surrounds the continents of the world, the primordial waters from which all creation emerged and to which all things will eventually return. The causeway you walk on is nearly as wide as a modern 4-lane road, and stretches for more than 200 meters across the water, elevated about 2 meters above the moat's surface, its length punctuated by small pavilions where you can rest and admire the view, where offerings might be made before entering the main temple complex. The stone paving is worn smooth by centuries of feet, and you can see in some blocks the marks where they were shaped, the grooves left by stone saws, the peck marks from chisels, evidence of the human labor that went into creating this seemingly eternal structure. At the far end stands the Western Gopura, a massive gateway complex 3 stories tall, its central tower rising to nearly 25 meters, its walls thick and solid, its passages cool and shadowed. As you pass through the Gopura, ducking your head slightly in the lower passages, feeling the temperature drop as the thick stone blocks the sun, you notice the carvings that cover almost every surface. There are apsaras in niches, their bodies posed in those impossible triple bent positions, their faces serene and slightly smiling, their jewelry and headdresses rendered in meticulous detail. There are guardian figures, powerful beings with fierce expressions, meant to bar entry to evil spirits and those who approach with impure hearts. There are floral motifs and geometric patterns that fill the spaces between the figurative carvings, creating a visual density that transforms the stone into something like fabric, something soft and flowing despite its hardness. When you emerge on the far side of the Gopura, stepping from shadow into brilliant sunlight that makes you squint and shield your eyes, you find yourself on a raised causeway that stretches ahead for another 350 meters, leading your eye directly to the temple proper. This causeway is elevated about 2 meters above the ground level, and as you walk it, you become aware of the enormous scale of everything around you. To your left and right, beyond low walls, stretch vast lawns, grass kept trimmed by the grazing of cattle, an unusual feature in Khmer temple architecture, but one that creates clear sight lines, that allows the temple to be seen in its entirety from multiple viewpoints, that emphasizes its mass and its perfection of proportion. The causeway is flanked on both sides by low walls topped with Naga balustrades, the serpent bodies forming the railings, sculpted with such care that you can see individual scales, the powerful muscles beneath the skin, their multiple heads raised at the ends in protective display, mouths open to show fangs, crests flared, eyes wide and watchful. These are not merely decorative elements but powerful protective symbols, the Nagas being ancient guardian spirits of this land, water deities, who controlled rain and fertility, who could be beneficent or dangerous depending on how they were treated, who had been incorporated into Hindu iconography but never lost their indigenous significance. The scale here is designed to overwhelm, to make you feel small and humble, to prepare you gradually for the even greater wonders ahead. The causeway is perfectly straight, its alignment so precise that engineers using modern instruments have found deviations of only millimeters over its entire length, perfectly level despite the slight natural slope of the land, its sandstone blocks fitted so precisely that you cannot slip a knife blade between them. This is engineering at the highest level, construction that has survived 800 years of monsoons and earthquakes, of armies marching across it and crowds gathering on it, that still stands true and level when so many buildings made with modern techniques have settled and cracked and required extensive repair. At the end of the causeway, you reach a cruciform terrace, a symbolic crossroads where paths intersect, where the cardinal directions meet, where the horizontal plane of human existence intersects with the vertical axis that connects earth to heaven. This terrace is decorated with more Naga balustrades, their bodies forming boundaries, their heads marking cardinal points, and with lions powerful and stylized sitting on their haunches, alert and watchful, symbols of royal power and divine protection. Beyond this terrace rises the temple proper, and it is here that you truly begin to grasp the enormity of what Surya created. The structure is arranged as 3 concentric rectangular galleries, each higher than the last, creating a stepped pyramid effect that mimics the profile of a natural mountain but with a regularity and symmetry that nature could never achieve. The outer gallery forms a rectangle roughly measuring 200 meters by 215 meters, its continuous wall creating an enclosed space, its interior surface carved with the longest and most elaborate bas-reliefs ever created, panels that stretch for hundreds of meters without a break, depicting scenes from Hindu mythology and from Surya Varman's own military campaigns. These are not crude or primitive carvings but sophisticated narrative art, works that demonstrate a complete mastery of technique and composition, that show hundreds of figures in dynamic action, battles and processions and cosmic events rendered in stone with a level of detail that rewards hours of careful study. The most famous of these relief panels depicts the churning of the ocean of milk, that great creation myth in which gods and demons work together, temporarily setting aside their eternal enmity to achieve a common purpose. The carving shows this cosmic tug-of-war in exhaustive detail. On one side, a line of gods, each figure distinct, their faces showing strain and effort, their muscles taut, their hands gripping the body of the serpent Vasuki who serves as the rope. On the other side, an equal line of demons, just as individualized, just as committed to the task, pulling in the opposite direction. At the center, Mount Mandara serves as the churning stick, and the god Vishnu appears in multiple forms, overseeing the process, maintaining balance, ensuring that the churning continues at the proper rhythm. As the churning proceeds, treasures emerge from the depths of the ocean, rendered in the relief with careful attention to their iconographic attributes. There is Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and prosperity, rising on a lotus flower, her beauty causing both gods and demons to pause in their labor to admire her. There is the physician of the gods, holding the vessel of Amrita, the elixir of immortality for which all this effort is being made. There are the Apsaras, celestial dancers, who emerge as a group and whose presence transforms the cosmic ocean into a place of beauty and grace. There is the poison that also emerges, which threatens to destroy all creation until Shiva drinks it and holds it in his throat, which turns blue from the toxin but does not allow it to spread. The technical skill required to carve this, to maintain consistent depth and proportion across hundreds of meters of continuous narrative, to ensure that figures at opposite ends of the panel relate to each other compositionally and narratively, is staggering. It represents not just the work of individual masters, but a school of artists working from shared conventions, trained in the same techniques, able to execute a unified vision across decades of labor. You can spend hours walking along this gallery, studying the reliefs, discovering new details with each viewing, understanding more of the theology and mythology with each careful observation, and still not exhaust everything that is here to be seen. As you move through the outer gallery and climb to the second level, the architecture becomes more complex, more layered, more sophisticated in its spatial arrangement. Here are libraries, standalone structures oriented to the north and south of the main axis, their corbelled roofs rising in distinctive tiered profiles, their interiors now empty but once filled with palm leaf manuscripts containing sacred texts, astronomical calculations, royal genealogies, the accumulated knowledge of the kingdom. Here are connecting galleries with elaborate false windows, stone screens carved to look like wooden shutters, allowing air and light to filter through while maintaining the architectural rhythm, creating patterns of light and shadow that change throughout the day as the sun moves across the sky. The walls everywhere are covered with carvings of apsaras, thousands of them, no two exactly alike, each one unique in the position of her hands, the tilt of her head, the details of her jewelry and headdress, the arrangement of her hair, the expression on her face. They dance in eternal stillness, their presence transforming the galleries into a kind of heavenly realm, a place where divine and mortal meet, where the boundaries between worlds dissolve. These are not portraits of real women, but idealized forms. Bodies shown in poses that would be impossible for actual humans to hold, proportions that emphasize grace and beauty over anatomical accuracy, expressions that suggest serene detachment from worldly concerns, the inner peace of those who dwell in celestial realms. The third and final level, the central platform that supports the 5 main towers, can only be reached by climbing steep staircases, each with a pitch of about 70 degrees, more ladder than stair. The steps so narrow that only the front half of your foot can rest on them. The rises so high that each step requires significant effort, especially in the heat and humidity that make exertion exhausting. This steepness is deliberate, a final test of worthiness, a physical enactment of the difficulty of achieving the divine realm, of ascending from the earthly plane to the celestial heights. You must climb facing the stones, unable to see where you are going, forced to trust in the structure's stability, in the countless feet that have climbed before you without the stairs collapsing, in the skill of the builders who created steps that would endure for centuries. When you finally pull yourself up onto the 3rd level, breathing hard from the climb and the heat, your legs trembling from the effort, sweat running down your face and soaking your clothes, you find yourself on a cruciform platform with a tower at each corner, and the central prasat rising from the middle. The platform is elevated enough that you can feel the breeze that rises here where there is nothing to block it, a relief from the stifling heat below, cool air moving across your wet skin and evaporating the sweat, providing a moment of physical comfort that enhances the sense of having achieved something significant, of having reached a place that not everyone attains. The central tower reaches 65 meters above ground level, and though it is solid stone, not hollow except for the chambers at its base, it seems almost to float, to defy gravity, to reach toward the sky with an elegance that belies its enormous weight. There are chambers at the tower's base, including the central sanctum where a statue of Vishnu once stood, nearly 4 meters tall, carved from a single block of stone, showing the god in his aspect as the preserver of cosmic order, standing upright with his 4 arms holding his characteristic attributes, the conch shell and the discus, the club and the lotus flower. This statue is gone now, removed or destroyed during later religious changes, but the chamber remains, still dark and cool, still smelling faintly of incense despite the centuries, still charged with a sense of sacred presence. From this 3rd level, if you walk to the edge of the platform and look out, you can see for miles across the flat landscape, across the moat that surrounds the complex, across the wooden city that has long since vanished, across the rice fields extending to the horizon, green during the growing season, golden during harvest, brown and stubble-filled during the dry months. You can see other temples in the distance, the stepped pyramid of the Bapayun, the towers of other royal monuments, the smoke rising from thousands of cooking fires, the glint of sunlight on water in the network of canals and reservoirs that sustain this entire civilization. You can feel the breeze that rises here, carrying the scent of wood smoke and cooking food, of flowers and incense, of the earth itself warming under the sun. You can see birds circling, eagles and kites riding the thermals that rise from the heated ground, flocks of smaller birds that make their homes in the countless niches and recesses of the temple's structure, building nests in places protected from rain and predators, raising their young in the shadow of the divine. You can hear their calls, a counterpoint to the chanting from below, a reminder that this stone mountain, despite being a human creation meant to house gods, is also part of the natural world, inhabited by creatures who care nothing for theology or politics but who have made this place their home. You can understand, standing here, why this was built, not just as a religious statement but as a political one. A declaration that the king who could create such a thing was indeed divine, that his power was absolute, that his kingdom would endure forever. The investment of resources required to build Angkor Wat was enormous, representing perhaps decades of surplus labor from tens of thousands of workers, massive quantities of stone transported over great distances, the full attention of the kingdom's best artists and engineers for a generation. The fact that Surya Varman could command such resources, could organize such a project and see it through to completion, was itself proof of his divine status, a demonstration of power that no mere mortal could achieve. The construction of Angkor Wat took approximately 30 years, an enormous project even by the standards of this civilization. The sandstone blocks, each weighing anywhere from hundreds of kilograms to several tons, came from quarries at Phnom Kulen over 30 kilometers to the northeast. They were moved during the wet season when the rising waters allowed them to be floated on rafts down rivers and canals, a journey that must have taken weeks for each trip, with teams of workers guiding the unwieldy loads through currents and around obstacles. At the site, more workers, perhaps tens of thousands of them, shaped the blocks, lifted them into place using a combination of earthen ramps, wooden scaffolding and elephant power, fitted them with the precision of fine cabinet work, and then carved them in place, transforming raw stone into narrative and decoration. These workers were not slaves in the classical sense but rather people fulfilling corvée obligations, required periods of labor owed to the state. They were fed and housed during their service, and while the work was hard and dangerous, with workers surely dying from accidents and illness, it was also considered meritorious, an act of religious devotion that would earn karmic rewards. The organization required to coordinate such a project was itself remarkable. Someone had to plan the extraction of stone, ensuring that the right types and sizes were quarried at the right times. Someone had to organize the transportation, maintain the canals and rafts, schedule the arrival of blocks to match the construction timeline. Someone had to manage the workforce, providing food and water and medical care, maintaining discipline, keeping morale high enough that the work continued year after year. Someone had to oversee the carving, ensuring that the decorative program remained consistent, that the quality met acceptable standards, that the sacred iconography was correct. This required not just artistic skill but administrative capacity, a bureaucracy capable of managing complexity across decades, and the fact that Angkor Wat was completed, that it stands today largely as intended, is testament to that organizational achievement as much as to the skill of individual masons. The temple was designed to be experienced in a specific way, entering from the west and moving east toward the rising sun, ascending through levels that represent stages of spiritual purification, finally reaching the central tower that represents the ultimate goal of enlightenment or union with the divine. The galleries were meant to be walked slowly, allowing time to study the reliefs, to absorb their teachings, to meditate on the cosmic narratives they depicted. The proportions of everything, the width of galleries, the height of towers, the placement of windows and doors, were calculated using sacred geometry, measurements based on units that had religious significance, alignments that corresponded to astronomical events. Nothing was arbitrary. Every element served both functional and symbolic purposes, creating a structure that was simultaneously a building and a mandala, a palace and a prayer, a tomb and a temple, collapsing categories that we usually keep separate into a unified expression of religious and political power. When Surya Varman died, probably around 1150, his temple was complete or nearly so, and his reign was considered a success. He had expanded the kingdom's territory, maintained the water systems, built the greatest temple ever seen. But he had also established a template that would prove both inspiring and dangerous. How could any subsequent king match this achievement? How could anyone build something more impressive than Angkor Wat? The answer would come from an unexpected direction, from a king who would break with tradition, who would embrace a different religious path, and who would in his own way build a temple complex that rivaled even Angkor Wat in ambition and surpassed it in sheer strangeness. His name was Jayavarman VII, and he came to power in the late 12th century after a period of civil war and invasion, the kingdom wounded and in need of strong leadership. Unlike his predecessors, Jayavarman was a devout Mahayana Buddhist rather than a Hindu, and while Buddhism had long been present in Cambodia, coexisting peacefully with Hinduism, no previous king had made it the official state religion. Jayavarman's Buddhism was of a particular type, focused on compassion and the bodhisattva ideal, the notion that one who has achieved enlightenment should delay entering nirvana in order to help all sentient beings achieve liberation. This theological shift would manifest in architecture that was both familiar and radically different from what had come before. Jayavarman built on a scale that matched or exceeded Suryavarman. He constructed a new capital, Angkor Thom, a walled city covering 9 square kilometers, surrounded by an 8-meter-high wall and a 100-meter-wide moat. At the center of this city, he built his temple mountain, the Bayon. But this was unlike any temple that had preceded it. Instead of the soaring vertical emphasis of earlier temples, the Bayon is more compact, a complex interlocking of towers and galleries that seems almost organic, like something that grew rather than was built. And covering these towers, carved from the stone itself, are faces, more than 200 of them, serene countenances each 2 meters or more in height, gazing out in the 4 cardinal directions from every tower. Imagine standing in the central courtyard of the Bayon on a late afternoon, the sun low in the sky, shadows lengthening. Everywhere you look, you see these faces, some smiling faintly, some with lips slightly parted, as if about to speak, their eyes half closed in meditation or contemplation. The effect is overwhelming, not threatening exactly, but intensely present, a feeling of being watched by a benevolent but all-seeing presence. The faces are generally identified with Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, though some scholars argue they also bear a resemblance to Jayavarman himself, suggesting that the king, in his humility, presented himself not as a god but as a bodhisattva, one who had achieved the capacity for enlightenment, but chose to remain in the world to serve others. The Bayon's galleries are covered with bas reliefs as extensive as those at Angkor Wat, but with a crucial difference. Where Angkor Wat's reliefs depict primarily mythological and religious scenes, the Bayons include extensive depictions of daily life, of markets and fishing, of cockfights and festivals, of ordinary people going about ordinary activities. There are battle scenes as well, showing Jayavarman's wars against the Cham invaders, who had sacked Angkor before his reign, naval battles fought on the Tonle Sap with detailed depictions of ships and weapons and hand-to-hand combat. These reliefs are a priceless historical record, showing us what Khmer life actually looked like in the 12th century, how people dressed and what tools they used, what their houses looked like, and how they prepared their food. Information that exists nowhere else because the houses and tools and clothes themselves have long since vanished. Jayavarman's building program extended far beyond the Bayon. He built hospitals throughout his kingdom, probably more than 100 of them, small temple-like structures that combined medical care with religious healing, staffed by monks who practiced herbal medicine and performed rituals for the sick. He built rest houses along the kingdom's roads, providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. He built temples at sites throughout his realm, creating a network of Buddhist sacred architecture that complemented but never entirely replaced the Hindu temples of earlier reigns. His vision seems to have been of a Buddhist kingdom where the king's role was not to demonstrate divine power through military might or architectural grandeur alone, but to demonstrate compassion through practical service to his people, building infrastructure that improved their lives while also earning karmic merit. This shift from Hinduism to Buddhism as the state religion was not as dramatic as it might seem. The two religions had coexisted in Cambodia for centuries, sharing many cosmological concepts, many of the same sacred sites. Hindu temples were not destroyed or abandoned when Buddhism became dominant. They continued to function, their Brahmin priests still performing rituals, their sacred lingams still receiving offerings. What changed was the emphasis. The royal patronage shifting to Buddhist institutions, the new temples built in Buddhist rather than Hindu forms. Even this was not absolute. Many temples show a blending of traditions, Hindu gods appearing alongside Buddhist figures, suggesting a synthetic religious culture that was comfortable with apparent contradictions, that saw value in multiple paths to the divine. The kingdom Jayavarman ruled was at the height of its power and extent. It controlled not just what is now Cambodia, but large portions of modern Thailand, Laos and Vietnam, a vast realm connected by rivers and roads, by shared religious culture and political allegiance to the god king in Angkor. Trade routes stretched from China in the north to the Indonesian archipelago in the south, bringing luxury goods and new ideas, exporting rice and fish and forest products. Chinese visitors who came to Angkor in the 13th century left written accounts describing a wealthy and sophisticated kingdom, its capital, a sprawling city of wooden buildings surrounding the stone temples, its markets full of goods from across Asia, its people prosperous and well-governed, its festivals and ceremonies elaborate and impressive. One such visitor was Zhou Daguan, a Chinese diplomat who spent nearly a year in Angkor in the late 13th century. His account, written after his return to China, provides details about Khmer life that we could not know from archaeology alone. He describes the royal palace, made entirely of wood and now vanished without trace, as being larger and more impressive even than the great stone temples. He describes the king's appearance on ceremonial occasions, riding an elephant surrounded by thousands of soldiers and officials, accompanied by music and the display of sacred regalia. He describes the role of women in society, noting that they handled most commercial transactions, managed household finances, and possessed considerable autonomy. He describes religious practices, both Hindu and Buddhist, noting the presence of monasteries and temples, the performance of elaborate rituals, the veneration of sacred objects. Zhou Daguan also noted some aspects of Khmer life that struck him as strange or noteworthy from his Chinese perspective. He was fascinated by the practice of teeth blackening, a cosmetic procedure in which the teeth were filed and then lacquered black, considered attractive and civilized in Khmer culture. He described bathing customs, noting that people bathed multiple times per day in the river or in ponds, a necessity in the tropical heat, but also a cultural practice with religious overtones, water serving both to cleanse the body and purify the spirit. He described the use of betel nut, chewed by people of all classes, staining their lips and mouths red, a mild stimulant and social lubricant. He described the variety of fruits available, many unfamiliar to him, and the abundance of fish, noting that the Tonle Sap provided such bounty during its annual flood that the entire kingdom could be fed from its waters. What emerges from Zhou Daguan's account, and from the archaeological evidence, is a picture of a complex cosmopolitan society, hierarchical but not rigidly so. Wealthy, but with wealth, distributed unevenly, deeply religious but tolerant of multiple traditions, politically centralized under the god king, but with considerable local autonomy for regional governors and temple administrators. It was a society that had solved the fundamental challenge of creating surplus in a tropical environment, that had developed sophisticated institutions to manage that surplus and direct it toward collective projects, that had created an aesthetic and religious culture of remarkable beauty and depth. It was also a society that had perhaps pushed the limits of what was sustainable, that had built on a scale that required constant inputs of labor and resources, that depended on systems so complex that any significant disruption could cascade into crisis. The first signs of strain began to appear in the 13th century, subtle at first, easy to dismiss as temporary setbacks that would be overcome as they had been in the past. The building program, so intense under Javam VII, began to slow. Subsequent kings built temples, yes, but smaller ones, less elaborate, suggesting either declining resources or a shift in priorities, a recognition perhaps that the old model of competing through monumental construction was no longer sustainable. The irrigation systems, which required constant maintenance to remain functional, began in some areas to silt up, channels filling with sediment that reduced flow rates, dikes developing leaks that went unrepaired, distribution systems becoming less efficient as the network degraded. The reasons for this decline are complex and debated. Perhaps the intensive rice agriculture that had supported the kingdom for centuries had depleted soil fertility, leaching nutrients from the fields, requiring more and more land to be brought under cultivation to maintain the same yields, pushing the agricultural frontier into marginal areas where productivity was lower and sustainability questionable. Perhaps deforestation, the cutting of trees for construction and fuel, for the massive amounts of charcoal needed to fire ceramics and smelt iron, had led to erosion and changes in rainfall patterns. The denuded hillsides, unable to hold water the way forested slopes did, the runoff more rapid and violent, carrying away topsoil, creating floods followed by droughts. Perhaps the population had simply grown too large to be sustained by the available agricultural technology, approaching the carrying capacity of the environment, reaching a point where any disruption, any bad harvest or military campaign that pulled labor from the fields, could tip the balance from surplus to shortage. Perhaps the religious focus shifted away from the great merit-making projects of temple building toward smaller-scale monasticism and meditation. Theravada Buddhism, emphasizing personal spiritual development over elaborate public rituals, reducing the incentive for massive public works, changing the relationship between religious practice and political power. External pressures were also increasing. To the west, the Thai kingdoms were growing more powerful, more organized, more aggressive, no longer the scattered tribal groups that earlier Khmer kings had easily dominated, but increasingly sophisticated states with their own ambitions, their own military capacities, their own claims to divine favor and cosmic legitimacy. They had adopted many aspects of Khmer culture, Sanskrit writing and Hindu-Buddhist religion, architectural styles and court rituals, but they were using these borrowed elements to build their own independent power, to challenge Khmer supremacy in the region. Raiders began to probe the Khmer frontier, testing defenses, seizing territory in border regions, withdrawing before Khmer armies could respond, returning to raid again when the armies departed. The Khmer response was hampered by internal conflicts, succession disputes that weakened the kingdom from within, civil wars in which royal princes fought for the throne, each claiming divine right, each gathering armies and followers, the kingdom tearing itself apart even as external threats grew. The unity that had characterized earlier periods, when the god-king's authority was unquestioned and the entire kingdom worked in concert toward common goals, began to fracture into competing factions, regional governors asserting more autonomy, temple complexes becoming semi-independent economic and political entities, the central authorities' control weakening. Religious changes may also have played a destabilizing role. The shift from Hinduism to Mahayana Buddhism under Jayavarman VII, while not inherently destructive, represented a change in the ideological foundation of kingship. The Hindu god-king had been a divine figure whose temple building and water management were religious obligations, whose power came from his identity with the gods themselves, whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. The Buddhist king was more of a righteous ruler, a bodhisattva who served his people through compassion and good governance, whose legitimacy came from moral virtue rather than divine essence. This was in some ways a more humane model, less prone to the excesses of absolute power, but it lacked the ideological clarity of the earlier system. If the king was not divine, what was the ultimate basis for demanding the massive labor contributions required to maintain the temples and water systems? If compassion and service were the highest values, why spend resources on monumental architecture rather than on direct aid to the suffering, on feeding the hungry and healing the sick? These questions did not have clear answers, and the ambiguity they created opened space for challenges to royal authority, for alternative visions of how society should be organized, for a gradual erosion of the consensus that had sustained the kingdom for so long. The transition to Theravada Buddhism, which became increasingly dominant from the 13th century onward, intensified these changes. Theravada emphasized individual meditation and monastic discipline, rather than elaborate ritual and temple worship. Its ideal being the monk who renounced worldly concerns to pursue enlightenment through study and contemplation. Its temples were simpler, often built of wood rather than stone, focused on monasteries where monks lived and studied, rather than on grand structures meant to house the divine or serve as cosmic diagrams. This shift meant that the old temples, the great Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist complexes that had been the centers of religious and political life, became less central to daily practice, receiving less maintenance and patronage, beginning a slow decline even while still technically in use. Still inhabited by monks who kept some version of the old rituals alive, but who no longer commanded the resources or authority they once had. The final blow came in 1431, when a Thai army from Ayutthaya, the rising power to the west, captured and sacked Angkor after a siege that may have lasted months or even a year, sources from this period being scarce and often contradictory. The city was not destroyed in the sense of being razed to the ground. Its stone temples were too massive for that, too solid to be easily demolished, but it was looted, its accumulated treasures carried away, its population dispersed or enslaved, its administrative apparatus collapsed, its networks of trade and tribute disrupted beyond immediate recovery. The psychological impact was perhaps as important as the physical destruction. Angkor had seemed invincible, the eternal capital, the center of the world, and its fall shattered that illusion, demonstrated that even the mightiest works of human hands were vulnerable, that divine favor could be withdrawn, that the cosmic order that had sustained the kingdom was not as stable as it had seemed. The Khmer court abandoned Angkor and moved the capital south to Phnom Penh, closer to the coast, better positioned for maritime trade in an era when the old land-based trade routes were increasingly insecure, easier to defend with a smaller army and less extensive fortifications. The move made strategic sense, adapting to new realities, but it represented a fundamental break with the past, an admission that the old ways were no longer viable, that the age of the god-kings and their temple mountains was over. Angkor was not entirely abandoned immediately. Buddhist monks continued to inhabit some temples, maintaining their monasteries, performing simplified versions of old rituals, living in small communities scattered through the vast complex. Local populations still lived in the area, farming the fields that could still be irrigated, fishing in the moat and in nearby water bodies, using the temples as landmarks and as sources of building stone when they needed it. But the great concentration of power and population that had made it a capital was gone. The tens of thousands who had lived in and around the temple complexes, dispersed to other regions or absorbed into the Thai kingdom that now controlled the area. The water systems, without centralized authority to organize their maintenance, without the labor pool to repair them when they failed, began their final collapse. Dikes breached during flood seasons and were not repaired, water spreading across fields that had been carefully leveled, destroying the gradient that allowed controlled irrigation. Channels silted up, vegetation taking root in the slow-moving water, debris accumulating until flow stopped entirely. The barrays slowly filled with sediment, their vast reservoirs reduced to swamps, then to dry depressions during the hot season, their carefully engineered banks crumbling, trees growing from cracks that widened into gaps. The rice fields that had supported tens or hundreds of thousands of people reverted to scrub forest and swamp, nature reclaiming land that had been held against it through constant labor. The boundary between cultivated and wild shifting back toward the wild with each passing year. Over the following centuries, the jungle began its patient reconquest, and it is this process, this gradual return of the forest, that transformed Angkor from a living city into the romantic ruin that would capture Western imagination in the 19th century. Trees grew in the courtyards, their roots spreading across the paving stones, seeking the cracks between blocks, finding purchase in the smallest gaps, their expanding roots gradually prizing the stones apart with a force that seems impossible from something that grows so slowly but that is irresistible, given enough time. Vines climbed the walls, their tendrils working into cracks, their weight pulling on weakened stones, their leaves creating shade that kept moisture trapped against the stone, accelerating the growth of moss and lichen that produce acids as they metabolize. Acids that slowly dissolve the minerals that bind sandstone together, turning solid rock gradually into something like sand again. Moss and lichen covered surfaces that had been carved with such care, green and orange and gray patches that spread year by year, obscuring details, softening edges, creating a natural patina that transformed the appearance of the stone. The wooden structures, the houses and palaces and administrative buildings that had surrounded the temples, rotted away first, vanishing within decades of abandonment. The tropical climate ensuring that wood lasted no more than a generation or two before it collapsed into fragments, then into pulp, then into soil. The temples, being stone, resisted longer, but even stone yields eventually to the relentless pressure of plant roots, to the chemical action of rain and lichens that slowly dissolves the stone's binding minerals, to the expansion and contraction caused by daily temperature swings, the stone heating in the midday sun and cooling at night. Millions of these tiny expansions and contractions gradually weakening the crystalline structure. The annual floods undercut foundations, water swirling around the base of walls, carrying away sediment, creating voids that caused settling and cracking. Earthquakes that shook the carefully balanced corbelled arches, already stressed by centuries of their own weight, until they collapsed in showers of stone blocks that crashed into the galleries below, filling passages with rubble, transforming open spaces into impassable chaos. Imagine Angkor Wat in the 16th century, 300 years after the capital's abandonment, 600 years after its construction. The moat is still there, though its edges are ragged, irregularly shaped, trees leaning out over the water, their roots exposed where the banks have eroded, water plants growing thick in the shallows, creating islands of vegetation that shift with the current. The causeway is largely intact, the sandstone blocks still holding their alignment, despite the weight of time, though grass grows in the joints between them where soil has accumulated, and small trees have taken root in places where damage to the paving allowed earth to collect, their roots working down between the blocks, gradually widening the gaps. The galleries are darker now than they were meant to be, their windows blocked by vegetation, by vines that have grown across the openings, by trees whose branches reach from outside to shade the interior, their floors covered with leaf litter inches deep, with fallen stones from the ceiling where corbels have collapsed, with the debris of centuries of abandonment. Birds nest in the upper reaches of the towers, swifts and swallows who dart in and out through the windows and damage sections of roof, their droppings accumulated in thick layers on the floors below, their constant movement creating a sound like rustling fabric. Bats roost in the interior chambers, hanging from the ceilings in clusters that cover entire surfaces, emerging at dusk in vast clouds that swirl and dive, hunting insects in the twilight, returning before dawn to sleep through the heat of the day. Monkeys move through the corridors, chattering and foraging, troops of macaques who have made the temple their territory, who know every passage and tower, who scramble up vertical walls with ease, who regard the occasional human visitors with curiosity or hostility depending on their mood and experience. In the central sanctum, the statue of Vishnu is gone, removed by looters who saw it as treasure rather than divinity, or destroyed by zealots who saw it as an obstacle to true faith, or simply degraded by time and neglect until it broke apart and was carried away piece by piece. The chamber is home now to spiders and insects, to bats who hang from the ceiling, to the dust and debris of abandonment, the eternal flames long extinguished, the offerings ceased, the rituals forgotten or transformed into something the original builders would not recognize. Yet the temple still stands, still recognizable as what it was, its basic structure intact even as details crumble, its fundamental form still clear even where damage is extensive. The great bas-reliefs are still readable in places, though many faces have been weathered smooth by centuries of rain and wind, though many inscriptions have been worn away until the letters are no more than shallow depressions in the stone, though some sections have been deliberately defaced by those who saw the images as threats to their own religious convictions. The towers still rise, though their lotus finials have fallen, crashing to the ground and breaking into fragments that lie scattered in the courtyards, though trees grow from cracks in their summits, their roots working their way through the solid stone, though the upper levels are dangerous now, stones loose and unstable, liable to shift without warning. And there are people here still, Buddhist monks who have established a monastery in one section of the complex, choosing to live among these ruins, maintaining a tradition of occupation that may have been continuous or may have lapsed and been renewed multiple times, the historical record being unclear on this point, sources from this period being scarce and often contradictory. These monks perform their rituals in a temple built for different gods, different purposes, but the sanctity of the place persists, transcending the specific religious forms that created it, the sense that this is a sacred space remaining even when the particular theology that defined its sacred nature has changed. They sweep the floors where they live, repair the roofs where they sleep, maintain the areas they use for meditation and study, but the rest of the vast complex they leave to the forest, accepting that most of it is beyond their capacity to preserve, that nature will take its course, that all human works are temporary, and that attachment to permanence is a form of suffering. Local populations know the temples well, incorporating them into their own cosmology, telling stories about the giants who built them in a single night, working with superhuman strength and speed, or about the gods who dwell in them still, invisible but present, demanding respect and offerings from those who pass by. These stories mix historical memory with pure myth, preserving fragments of truth about the temple's origins while transforming them through oral transmission into legends that serve present needs, that explain the inexplicable, that make sense of ruins whose scale and sophistication seem impossible for ordinary humans to have created. The locals use the temples as quarries sometimes, taking stones to build their own houses or village shrines, a practical recycling that accelerates the decay. but also represents a kind of continuity, the stones of Angkor Wat literally becoming part of the living landscape, incorporated into structures that serve current needs rather than memorializing an extinct past. The great city has become a sacred forest, a place of mystery and power, inhabited not by kings and thousands of workers, but by spirits and animals, and the occasional human visitor who comes to make offerings, to meditate in the ruins, to seek blessings from the monks who live there, or simply to marvel at what remains, to wonder at the civilization that created such things, and then vanished, leaving only stone and stories. This was the state of Angkor when the first European explorers began to arrive in the 16th and 17th centuries, Portuguese missionaries seeking converts, French naturalists cataloguing the plants and animals of Southeast Asia, traders looking for opportunities in this region that was becoming increasingly connected to global networks of commerce and colonialism. These early visitors wrote accounts that mixed accurate observation with wild speculation, often claiming to have discovered ancient ruins that were completely unknown, ignoring or dismissing the knowledge of local populations who had never stopped knowing the temples were there, who had maintained continuous awareness of these structures, even as the cities around them vanished, who told the visitors stories about their origins that were recorded but often not believed, the Europeans preferring their own theories about lost civilizations and mysterious builders. These early accounts circulated in Europe but did not create a major sensation, Europe being more interested in other regions, in the Americas being colonized and the riches of India being exploited, Southeast Asia remaining peripheral to European consciousness for another 2 centuries. It was not until the mid-19th century, when French colonial expansion brought European archaeologists and adventurers to Southeast Asia in larger numbers, that Angkor entered Western consciousness in a significant way. The most famous of these Europeans was Henri Mouhot, a French naturalist who visited Angkor in 1860 and wrote enthusiastically about what he saw, describing the temples in terms that captured European imagination, comparing them favorably to anything built by the Greeks or Romans, expressing astonishment that such sophistication could exist in what Europeans then considered a primitive and backward region. His descriptions were vivid and detailed, his drawings careful and accurate, and when his journals were published posthumously, they created a sensation in Europe, establishing Angkor as one of the great archaeological sites of the world. Mouhot is often credited with discovering Angkor, a claim that ignores the continuous presence of Cambodian and Thai populations who never forgot it existed, who had maintained temples and monasteries there for centuries, who could have told him everything he wanted to know if he had thought to ask properly, rather than assuming he was the first civilized person to encounter these ruins. But his writings did bring Angkor to widespread Western attention and began the process of systematic archaeological study that continues today, more than a century and a half later. That study has transformed our understanding of Angkor, using methods Mouhot could not have imagined, uncovering details of its construction and operation that he never suspected. We can now read the inscriptions that he could not decipher, understanding the dynastic sequences, the religious dedications, the economic systems that supported the temples, the names and genealogies of kings and priests and donors, creating a historical narrative where he saw only mystery. We can use satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to map the entire urban layout, revealing the vast extent of the city that Mouhot saw only in part, discovering neighborhoods and water systems and roads that left no surface trace but that show up in subtle variations in vegetation, in slight changes in elevation, in differences in soil composition visible only from the air or through specialized instruments. We have excavated sites that provide evidence of daily life, of what people ate and wore and how they organized their households, finding pottery and tools and food remains that tell us about diet and technology and trade, about the rhythms of daily existence that supported and sustained the more visible achievements of monumental architecture. We have comparative studies of other Southeast Asian temple complexes that put Angkor in context, showing it as the supreme example of a widespread cultural pattern rather than an isolated anomaly, connecting it to similar sites in Thailand and Laos and Vietnam and Indonesia, understanding how ideas and craftsmen circulated across the region, how different kingdoms competed and copied and innovated, creating a rich tapestry of cultural production that Angkor represents at its most elaborate and ambitious, but that was never unique or isolated. Conservation efforts have stabilized many of the structures, removing dangerous trees whose roots were actively destroying stonework, reinforcing walls that were leaning dangerously, reconstructing collapsed towers using anastylosis, a technique that uses the original stones wherever possible, fitting them back together like a three-dimensional puzzle, adding new material only where original blocks are missing or too damaged to reuse. The process is delicate, requiring a balance between preserving what remains and allowing the natural processes that have become part of the site's character to continue. A completely cleaned and restored Angkor would in some ways be false to its history, would erase the centuries it spent as a forest temple, would present only one moment in time rather than the full complexity of its life. The challenge is to maintain enough to prevent total collapse while respecting the layers of meaning and use that have accumulated over centuries, to preserve both the original vision of the builders and the subsequent history of abandonment and partial reclamation, to make the temples accessible to visitors without destroying them through overuse, to balance the demands of tourism with the needs of conservation, to ensure that what is passed to future generations is authentic rather than a reconstruction that reflects our own ideas about what the past should look like. And so we come to the end of our journey through time, our visit to a world that no longer exists except in stone and memory, in the ruins that stand in the jungle, and in the words of inscriptions carved by hands that turned to dust centuries ago. What remains today at Angkor is extraordinary but also fragmentary, a partial record of a complete world, the stone monuments that survive giving us access to some aspects of Khmer civilization, while others remain forever hidden, knowable only through imagination and inference. The temples allow us to walk through spaces that were walked through 1,000 years ago, to see carvings that were carved when Europe was in the Middle Ages and the Americas were unknown to the Old World, to feel something of the awe that must have struck visitors when Angkor Wat was new and brilliant with paint and gold, when the city around it was alive with people and activity, when it stood at the center of a thriving kingdom that believed it would endure forever. But the city around the temples is gone, reduced to soil and slight irregularities in the ground surface, visible only through archaeological techniques. Its wooden houses and markets and gardens and workshops vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The people are gone too, the specific individuals who built and worshipped and lived in these spaces, their names remembered only in inscriptions, their thoughts and feelings and daily concerns lost entirely, leaving a gap between the physical remains and the lived experience that no amount of study can completely bridge. The legacy of Angkor extends far beyond the physical ruins. It lives in the cultural memory of Cambodia, in the pride Cambodians feel in this heritage that connects them to a glorious past, in the image of Angkor Wat that appears on the national flag, in the classical dance traditions that preserve movements and meanings that were once performed in temple courtyards, in architectural forms that echo the temple mountain design, in literary traditions that preserve Sanskrit and Pali texts. For the wider world, Angkor serves as a reminder of what human creativity and organization can achieve, of the heights that pre-industrial societies could reach, challenging assumptions about progress and development, demonstrating that sophisticated architecture and engineering existed in Southeast Asia while Europe was emerging from what it calls the Dark Ages. The temples themselves, standing in the forest, continue to exert a powerful hold on imagination. They are beautiful in their decay, the stone and the trees growing together, creating compositions that no architect intended, but that seem almost perfect in their combination of human order and natural chaos. The roots flowing over the carved surfaces like frozen water, the trees rising from courtyards and towers as if they had always been there, had grown up with the stones rather than invaded them later. This beauty is melancholic, tinged with the awareness of impermanence, of the inevitable victory of nature over human works, of the silence that falls when the voices cease and the jungle returns. But it is also strangely hopeful, suggesting that even in abandonment and decay, meaning persists, that the labor of hands that turn dust to stone creates something that outlasts its creators, that speaks across centuries to people who never knew the kings who commissioned it, but who can still respond to the vision it embodies. The story of Angkor is ultimately a story about ambition and impermanence, about the human drive to create something that will last and the inevitability of change that ensures nothing lasts unchanged. The kings who built these temples believed they were building for eternity, creating structures that would house their divine essence forever, that would earn them immortality through the merit of their donations and the continuation of rituals performed in their memory. In a sense they succeeded. The temples still stand. We still speak their names, Suryavarman and Jayavarman, Indravarman and the rest, pronunciations perhaps not exactly as they were spoken, but recognizable derivations of the Sanskrit names they chose for themselves. But not in the way they intended. The rituals have changed. The gods have changed. The very civilization they ruled is gone, replaced by others with different languages, different beliefs, different systems of power and meaning. Yet something persists, some quality of vision and achievement that allows us to recognize across the gulf of centuries that these people were like us, that they dreamed and built and worshipped, that they created beauty that still moves us even when we do not fully understand its original meanings, that they organized their society to achieve collective goals that required the coordination of thousands of people over generations, that they believed in something beyond their individual lives and worked to make that belief manifest in the world. This recognition creates a kind of continuity, a thread connecting past to present, allowing us to see ourselves in them and them in us, to understand that while the specifics change, while languages and technologies and political systems come and go, the fundamental human impulses, the desire to build and create and leave a mark, remain constant. And so our story of the hidden temples of Cambodia comes to a close, not with endings but with continuity, not with continuity, not with conclusions, but with questions that remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The temples stand, half revealed and half hidden, stone and forest merged into something that is both ruin and living presence, monument and meditation on impermanence. They remind us that all civilizations rise and fall, that all human works eventually return to the earth from which they came, but also that the act of creation matters, that the effort to build something beautiful and meaningful, to reach toward the divine, to leave a mark that outlasts our brief lives, is fundamentally human and fundamentally worthwhile. The god-kings are gone, their divine authority dissolved, their absolute power vanished like morning mist, their names remembered only in inscriptions carved in languages most people cannot read. But the stones they left behind still stand, still teach, still inspire, and in that there is a kind of immortality after all, imperfect and transformed but real nonetheless. The temples do not stand as they did when they were new, brilliant with paint and crowded with worshippers, but they stand nonetheless, and they will continue to stand for as long as we have the will to preserve them, for as long as we value the connection they provide to a past that is gone but not entirely lost. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through a world that no longer exists except in stone and memory, through the heat and light of a tropical kingdom where stone towers reached toward heaven and water was harnessed to feed millions, where dancers moved in eternal grace and priests chanted Sanskrit prayers, where a civilization rose to heights it could not sustain and fell into a silence that lasted centuries. Our story fades now like the light fading from these ancient walls, like the chanting fading when the last priest dies, like the memory fading when the last person who remembers is gone. But the temples remain, dreaming in the forest, patient and enduring, waiting for dawn to light their towers once again, waiting for new generations to walk their galleries and wonder at what was achieved here, in this flat green landscape by people who lived and died 1,000 years ago, and left behind works of stone that still speak to us across the silence. Until next time, rest well, and let the echoes of distant ages carry you gently into sleep.